I entirely accept, and some Australians might be surprised by this, they say, no, I can't understand a leftist perspective. I think I can. I can understand the nobility of wanting to ensure that everyone is respected as a full member of the human family, of our culture and our society. But this is where it gets so tricky, and it's where I think many young people are starting to wake up. They're being sold a pup. Mm-hmm. Do you have that expression in Canada?
No.
Sold a pup?
No.
Sold a dud.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
I see, yeah.
It's not a sound idea.
Right.
That many of the things that sound attractive don't necessarily work. So perhaps we need to be arguing the case for freedom and fairness, which will produce at least a high degree of equality of opportunity, mm-hmm. rather than arguing for equality, which history tells us tends to severely erode freedom.
Yeah. Well, it's a harder sale though, because it's easy to appeal to compassion immediately, thoughtlessly, right? And since that's such an instantaneously positive moral virtue, and you don't need sophisticated argumentation to buttress it, it's a lot more difficult to make a cold analytical case that the proposition freedom first, let's say, freedom and responsibility first, lifts the bottom up better. Yeah. It's a cold argument, and it requires rationality to parse through, so it's a harder sale.
I would argue, though, it's not just rationality, it's history. If you bring rationality and honesty to the study of history, I think the case is actually quite compelling.
I think it is too.
In fact, I think it's open and shut.
I think it's well, there's a book that I've just been reading that I would recommend by a man named Walter Scheidel, and he wrote a book called The Great Leveler, which I really like. It's an empirical analysis of inequality. And his research questions were something like, well, what is the phenomena of inequality? To what can you attribute it? And what, if anything, can we do to ameliorate it? Okay, so the first answer is something akin to what I wrote in the first rule in my book, 12 Rules for Life, which is, well, you can't lay hierarchy and inequality at the feet of Western civilization or capitalism. We're done with that argument. That's wrong. Animal societies are hierarchical and they produce unequal distributions. And there's evidence for that in the biological realm going back 1/3 of a billion years. And that's happened for so long that your nervous system has primarily adapted to it. So it's a deep reality. And blaming it on capitalism, it's like, no. Inequality is a big problem. It's way worse than Marx thought. Okay, fine. And people tend to stack up at zero. That's a bad thing because it destabilizes your society to have people who are so far down in the underclass that they have nothing to lose by flipping the game. That's a bad idea. And it drives male-on-male homicide as well. And the social science evidence for that is clear. All right, so we want to ameliorate inequality to some degree because we don't want people to stack up at zero and destabilize the society. And we don't want young men in particular to become violent. Fine. So then Scheidel takes another tack. It's like, his observations, he looked at Neolithic grave sites for signs of inequality. And you see what people are buried with. And in one of his cases, there's 200 people in a grave, and one of them has 190 pounds of gold, and the next richest person has like 4 ounces of gold, and then everyone else has none. It's like, so even in these Neolithic societies, inequality was the rule. Hunter-gatherer societies are the same way, except the inequality isn't material because they don't have a surplus. Inequality is everywhere. Okay, so then Scheidel asks 2 other questions. One is, well, how has it generally been reduced? Pestilence and war. That's it. So you can reduce inequality if you demolish everything, because that just brings everyone down to zero, but the inequality is less. And then he does an empirical analysis and asks a very interesting practical question, which is, imagine that you totted up the inequality coefficients of the right-wing societies, and you did the same with the left-wing societies. Is there a difference between the inequality coefficients? And you'd hope, yes, because you'd hope that what would happen as a consequence of activity on the left would be that something would actually occur to ameliorate inequality. He found no evidence for that whatsoever. So the left is sensitive to the catastrophe of inequality, let's say, but they're compassion-oriented doctrines designed to ameliorate that. On the positive side, there's plenty of resentment on the left too, and I don't want to sweep that under the rug. Their compassion-oriented policies do not produce an improvement in the equal distribution of goods. Yeah. So it's a way bigger problem than we think. So So, and putting into place these thoughtless, compassionate doctrines, let's say, putting them in place again is just going to produce exactly the same outcomes that were produced all through the 20th century.